All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Or good morning or good evening, wherever you are. This is Dr. Patrick Lockwood coming back to you live to talk about intellectual honesty. And I know this is kind of a departure from my normal talks on science and psychology and other concepts of wellness. So today will be a little more extemporaneous, a little more kind of focused on what's really going on with us nowadays, especially in Western countries like the US. And it's relevant because, I've been talking about my upcoming book, The Fear Problem, and my goal with the book, once it comes out, is to help people live a life with a more reasonable understanding of their fear process and actually be able to befriend their fear in such a way that we actually have better lives. Because I think, as I'll talk about today, we are really struggling, I believe. I believe there is a huge battle in many corners of the world, including the US where I live, about what's right, what's true, what should we do, how should we live. And that's why I started doing these live talks about wellness and the science of wellness and neuroscience and psychology. And I think one of the main problems that we're facing that's keeping us from living better lives as individuals and cultures and nationalities and as a global community is the fact that there's a lot we don't know. And there's a lot we'd like to think we know. And we like to assume things because it helps us feel safe. And it keeps us oriented and moving forward. And I think this shows kind of a lack of intellectual honesty. And that's the topic today is, what does it really mean to be intellectually honest? And what does it mean to actually know things and really act upon that information accurately and correctly? Now, this is a deep philosophical question that I couldn't possibly do any kind of justice to. So I'm just going to mention a couple of things and speak my piece, and this will be a shorter video. And then I'll leave it for you to decide if what I'm proposing, what I'm espousing, actually makes sense. And hopefully you will agree, and if you don't, I look forward to any kind of disagreement because I think that's what helps us learn and grow and change our minds. Part of being intellectually honest is being able to change your mind when new facts are presented, new credible facts. And I think we struggle with that. And I want to start today's talk off with a quote from Lucretius. He's an author before the Common Era, ancient Rome, ancient Greece, who said, "Life is a long journey in the dark." And I think that's absolutely true. I think we know so much. So you hear me talk about neuroscience a lot and how the brain functions. And we know so much more now in 2017 than we knew in 1917, than we knew in 1817. We knew relatively nothing in 1817. And now we know how basic cells in the brain function. And we know what pathways are generally responsible for what behaviors and thoughts and feelings and experiences, which is great. We know more than we've ever known. However, there's still so much we don't know. And I try and have an honest representation whenever I speak about something with caveats and hedges. And, I always say I'm not a physician, so I can't speak. I'm not a neurologist, etc. But this is what the research says specifically. Because I want to be honest about what I know and what I believe I know and what still is not known. And I think that's the problem, is if you take a look at pretty much any topic nowadays in our discourse, whether it's politics or war or economics or religion or anything, we'd like to think that we know enough to make well-informed decisions about how to act. And I think that that is somewhat true. However, I think we're also operating based upon our biases, which I spoke about in a previous video a month or so ago. And we operate kind of more automatically and less critically. We don't think critically enough anymore. And part of that is because I think the educational system doesn't do its job well and teach us critical thinking. It teaches us to rote memorize things and concepts so we can achieve test scores and perform, but not really think. And I think that's one concept that we could spend hours discussing and debating. But I think generally speaking, culture, Western culture in particular, very much struggles to really intellectually, honestly approach topics, and that keeps us from really learning and growing and moving forward. So here's a thought. So since, modern philosophical thought came into the picture, so around ancient Rome, ancient Greece, the time of Lucretius and Plato and Cicero, these people were trying to discuss what really exists, what really is true, and by what reasoning and what evidence do we determine that something is true. And in the world of my profession in particular, social psychology, that was kind of the first time in around 1920 when we actually said, how do we know what intellectual honesty is? And they did some experiments to actually figure out, what that looks like and how often people engage in what's called intellectual honesty. So I think it's a newer concept, even though it's been discussed in and out, since the, 2,400 years ago or further back. We've kind of lost our way and let go of this topic, and I think it's produced all sorts of negative consequences for us, which is why I'm going to discuss that heavily in my book coming out in October or so. And it's just funny, I did a quick scan of the research the other day just to see, what modern society thinks of this concept, and it seems like the fields of understanding substance abuse, medicine, education, and other facets of academia, politics, culture, religion, other sciences, and the legal system, I found research showing that these individuals are concerned about the lack of intellectual honesty, that people are operating on gut assumptions and incomplete information to make decisions. And that has never ended well for anyone in any kind of non-threatening, high-threat circumstance. When we're not having a gun pointed at our face, we have the time and ability to really try and think through things in order to make the best decision. We have this huge brain with hundreds of billions of neurons to allow us to function and make real critical decisions based upon lots of ideas and information that I think is just underutilized nowadays. And I've got kind of 20 citations here that kind of confirm that idea, is that we've let go of critical thinking. And another way in which this shows up, I think, is just in what we call tribalism in evolutionary psychology research. When we're afraid and lost and not sure what to do, our natural instinct is to rely on the people who think like us, seem like us, act like us, sound like us, in order to make decisions and feel safe and move forward in the world. And tribalism is adaptive to a degree, and I think what you're seeing right now, for instance, with politics in the United States and with groups like Black Lives Matter and other kind of organizations in that kind of train of thought, conservatives, alt-right, yada, 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 you're seeing like a heavy reliance on tribalism as a means of feeling safe and survival. And I think that's problematic because we are not currently living in a world where we need such rigid tribalism in order to function. We have all sorts of freedom in most Western countries, and we have wealth, and we have capacity, we have medicine, we have all these things that allow us to live a lot longer in a lot more free manner that are great, but are currently being overwhelmed by our fear process, which is causing us to go back to our more tribalistic kind of behavior modes and functioning more primally, more primitively. And that's a problem. because we're fighting about shit that doesn't matter. We're talking about things that do not matter and should not ever matter. And we are engaged in a form of rhetoric, a discourse level that is beneath us as primates with really large brains, with complex thinking capacity. We're debating topics that don't need to be debated. We need to simply just move on and take the next best critical thinking approach to whatever the topic is. So here's a simple example that's kind of more recent and needs to be discussed so minimally. Right now, if you're following the just preposterous news media in the US about what the president said about kneeling at football games and how unpatriotic that is, or I don't even know what he said because I don't care. But there's been a backlash by people in the NFL, football players, who are kneeling and taking pictures and grouping up and becoming a tribe and all sorts of good stuff like that. And if you take a minute and think, if you just think real critically for a minute, in order to survive, how important is it to either kneel or stand when looking at the flag during a football game in this country, in the US? So if you're a US citizen and you're watching and you're listening to me speak, just think about that for a second. How important is it for your survival in order to function and live a healthy life, whether or not you stand or you kneel at a football game when the national anthem is being played? Will you die in this country specifically if you kneel or stand? Generally speaking, I'm sure there are exceptions. I'm sure there are radical, crazy people who will murder you. But in this country, based upon our laws, our constitution, our society, our cultural norms, no one is going to go murder someone for kneeling. It's just statistically very, very rare, right? And in order to come to that conclusion on my part, that it's statistically rare that we would be murdered for kneeling or standing or whatever, you have to think through all the complex dynamics. What does the Constitution say? What do our state laws say? What do our national laws say? You know, what is the likelihood of someone murdering someone about something like standing or kneeling? We have to process hundreds of facts in order to come to the conclusion that I came to, which is it's statistically rare that someone would go murder someone over standing or kneeling at a football game when the national anthem is being played. Now, if you were to take this example to another country, you know, if you were to take this example back to, 1940s Germany, for instance, where, maybe the more militaristic Nazis would kind of beat you up if you weren't, going Heil Hitler or something, or even murder you if you're going against the Fuhrer, then it's a more reasonable thing to be worried about and want to discuss and think about and talk about and protest against and all sorts of good stuff, because you don't want to die, right? That's a reasonable time to be afraid and to want to do something to show this is not okay. However, all of this bullshit, and I mean that literally, it's just crap, it's useless excrement, this discussion of topics that do not matter to our ability to survive and live a healthy life. Things like politics, things like kneeling and standing in a football game. This should never be newsworthy. This should never be something that we have to critically discuss. But it is, because we're very, very tribalistic nowadays. And we have, I would say, honestly speaking, using a psychology term, I would say that we've actually regressed as a culture in the United States. And this is true for other countries that are Western as well, where there's more primal, tribalistic ways of operating. And I think it's just killing us. I think it's holding back progress. I think it's keeping us talking about red herrings. I think it's keeping us fighting about things that do not need to be fought over. And that's a problem, because life is more delicate than that. And life is more complex and challenging than just whether or not we stand at a football game. And I think it shows incredible, just almost moronic, like IQ less than 50, thinking whenever we actually sit there and we argue about something like flag or standing or kneeling during the national anthem, because we're not actually focusing on what really matters. We're focusing on crap that will never affect our daily life in a meaningful way. We're focusing on nothing that affects our health, our immediate needs for survival, our immediate needs for intellectual growth. There's just no conceivable way where this is important. However, because of our tribalism, because of our fear, because of how the news media is empty and vacant and trying to survive and bullshit, they're making a big deal out of political crap. And that's a problem. I think we have a huge problem here in this country, and it's all stemming from a lack of intellectual honesty because our fear process has overtaken our critical thinking process. And that's why the book is coming out, because I'm frankly very concerned. I'm not an old man. I'm 30, basically. And I haven't lived a long life, but I've lived long enough and read enough and been around in the world enough to know that fear is a problem. And that tribalism in particular is a problem. This is why you hear other people who are older, wiser, smarter than I talk about this shit. You know, this is stuff that Christopher Hitchens used to talk about. These are topics that Sam Harris and Daniel Dennett still talk about and debate about. These are really, really important topics because it's how we survive. The decisions we make today about what kind of culture we have, whether or not we actually think through things or not, whether or not we actually choose to be mindful and thoughtful about where we go and what we do, will determine what our present looks like and our future looks like. And so far, in the last, I'd say 35, 40 years, we've taken some steps backwards. And that's a problem, because we deserve better. You know, there's no such thing as a life devoid of suffering and pain. However, I think we've created unnecessary suffering. Really have. I think there's really just an egregious amount of unnecessary suffering that people are coping with nowadays by getting high all the time. I think that's one of the reasons we have an opioid crisis. We're more disconnected, more lonely, more tribal, and it's causing just horrible problems. And I think the opioid crisis is a good current example of that. And I think it's what keeps us fighting all the time about things that do not matter. Tweets, news stories, statements, just none of it matters. It's not important for our survival or our well-being, but we've made it that important. We have collectively as a culture said, these are topics worth discussing, and they're not. So I want to implore all of you to look at all of your beliefs, whether it's your religious beliefs, your political preferences, your understanding of your self-identity, your philosophical beliefs, you know, whatever they are, whatever beliefs you have, I want to challenge you to really seriously sit back and go, what evidence do I have for this being true? And is the evidence credible? What do I really know? Do I really know enough to make an informed decision about something like a healthcare bill or who to vote for or anything of that nature? Do I really understand complex topics like evolution, sexual orientation, all that stuff well enough? Because one of my favorite examples is sexual orientation, and I'm going to piss some of you off, but the science is what the science is. I've likely studied it more than any of you have. Sexual orientation is not a matter of biology. To whom we are attracted, to what intensity we are attracted to different kinds of people based upon their physical makeup, their 23rd chromosome, how healthy they look, what gender they describe themselves to be. All these things are not just biology. I'm sorry. You can even look at the American Psychological Association's statement on that. They admit that sexual orientation is at least in part changed, modified, mediated by our environmental experiences. That's a research-based fact that people have been arguing over for the past, I'd say, 100 years, since Freud called homosexuality a neurotic, not a neurotic, I'm sorry. Freud described homosexuality as a problem trying to resolve the Oedipus complex. Okay, since that time, we've really been heavily debating it in the scientific literature, medical, sociology, psychology. It's been highly debated. And the state of science right now in 2017 is both play a part. Anyone who's not willing to admit that there's a biological component and a social psychological component to sexual orientation, because it's such a complex topic, is ignorant and not willing to think intellectually honestly. And that's a problem. And this is what creates tribalism, because either you were born this way, according to Lady Gaga's bullshit song, or it's all nurture, which is also bullshit. There are very few things in life that are just pure nature or pure nurture. Very few things. So to not think that way about any topic is silly and actually creates more divide, more us versus them. So I want to sit here, and again, before I go, just implore you to start thinking more critically. And what the research shows will help with this is, in order to, have better critical thinking skills, operate with more intellectual honesty, break down the rigid barriers and tribalism, we need to actually try and understand the complexity of issues. We need to be more transparent about what we know versus what we don't know versus what is theoretical at this time. And we need to have a cultural, person-to-person, group-to-group discussion about whether or not we're really using our critical thinking process when we're debating each other. Because I don't think we are. I think we're responding with sound bites and ad hoc bullshit and ad hominem crap, which is even worse. Attacking a person's character, not the ideas, is even worse because it creates more fear and more of an us versus them process. So, again, book is coming out soon. I'm going to talk more about the fear problem in future videos. I know this has been kind of a little more all over the place, not very scientific. I have a lot of sources that I'll post in my Patreon post that kind of support my ideas here. However, I want you all to just feel free, and that's what intellectual honesty is. It's freedom to go, I don't know. It's freedom to go, I know this much, or I know this much. And we need to take advantage of that freedom, because otherwise, as Lucretia said, we're going to continue wandering through life, through the long journey of life, in more darkness. And we're going to create more darkness, I think, the more we shove our heads in the sand, act like tribalistic apes, and fight each other over crap that does not matter, or with information that is not valid, or with ideas that are not valid, that have not been thought through. So this is Dr. Patrick Lockwood saying thank you for listening, and I hope that I've at least challenged you a little bit to re-examine your beliefs, to question yourself how much you really know, how much you don't know. And this is something I do for myself, and this is something that I always encourage others to do in my life, my family, my friends, my coworkers, my clients, my patients, because that is what helps us survive the best, is really thinking through things in situations of, that are not high threat, basically. In high threat situations, your automatic response is going to be what it is, and that's going to help you survive. But daily experiences of sitting in the car, sitting at work, listening to me talk, there should be no threat here. I don't have a gun pointed at you. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm simply saying we need to think more and think through things more and challenge our beliefs, because our beliefs are biased. And our beliefs are, I think, nowadays more fear-driven than they have been in 100 years. So I look forward to seeing you all next week. I hope you have a great week, and I hope you enjoy challenging yourself a little bit. Bye.